When Reese Callahan rode into Silvage with her father's rifle across her saddle and determination burning in her eyes, the town didn't just whisper, they declared war. A woman running a ranch alone in 1878 Colorado wasn't just scandalous, it was an invitation for every vulture to circle closer. The bank gave her 60 days to pay $200 or lose everything her father had built. But when a weathered stranger named Clay Maddox heard the mayor's wife call Reese wild and unfit, he didn't turn away. He smiled and said, "Good. That means you'll match me just fine." If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Reese's story travels. And if you love a tale of grit, defiance, second chances, and love forged in the fires of the American frontier, stay until the very end. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that'll move your soul, and let's ride this trail together. When a wild heart meets a wandering soul, the woman who defied an entire town to save her father's legacy. The summer of 1878 came to Silvage, Colorado, like a fever, hot, relentless, and unforgiving. The kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the dirt roads and turned the distant mountains into wavering ghosts. Dust settled on everything, the false-fronted buildings along Main Street, the water troughs outside the saloon, the dreams of people who'd come west thinking land meant freedom. Reese Callahan had stopped believing in dreams 3 months ago, the day they buried her father. She sat now on the ridge above the ranch, her father's rifle resting across her knees, watching the valley below. The Callahan spread wasn't much 600 acres of tough grass, a creek that ran year-round, and timber rights that stretched into the foothills. Her father, Thomas Callahan, had broken his back building it from nothing. He'd raised Reese alone after her mother died, teaching her to ride to shoot, to read the weather and the land. He'd never once told her she couldn't do something because she was a woman. The town had different ideas. From her vantage point, Reese could see the gaps in the fence line, the barn that needed new shingles, the cattle scattered too thin across the south pasture. 3 hired hands had quit the week after the funeral, not because the work was hard. They'd known hard work. They quit because they wouldn't take orders from a woman, especially one who insisted on wearing split riding skirts and carrying a knife on her belt. Reese touched the handle of that knife, now smooth horn, worn to fit her palm. It had been her father's before she claimed it as her own. The sun was starting its slow descent when she finally rode down toward the ranch house. The gelding beneath her, a rangy buckskin named Ash, picked his way carefully down the rocky slope. She'd trained him herself, and he was one of the few things in her life she trusted completely. The house sat in a grove of cottonwoods, their leaves rustling in the hot breeze. It was a solid structure, 2 rooms plus a loft built from timber her father had milled himself. Reese had been born in the smaller bedroom. She'd learned to read at the kitchen table. She'd sat beside her father's bed in that same room and watched him die, his lungs finally giving out after years of breathing stone dust from the mine where he'd worked before claiming this land. She unsaddled Ash and turned him into the corral, checking the water level in the trough. Low again. Everything was low water supplies, money, hope. Inside, she lit the lamp and pulled out the ledger book. The numbers hadn't changed since this morning, but she checked them anyway as if arithmetic might suddenly become more forgiving. The banknote was due in 57 days. $200. It might as well have been $2,000. She'd sold off 12 head of cattle last month just to buy supplies and pay the 2 remaining hands, old Pete Garza, who stayed more out of loyalty to her father's memory than faith in her, and Jimmy Chen, whose family ran the laundry, and who worked the ranch on weekends because no one else in town would hire a Chinese man for ranch work. 2 men couldn't run 600 acres. 2 men couldn't repair fences, move cattle, cut hay for winter, and handle the 100 other tasks that kept a ranch alive. Reese closed the ledger and pressed her palms against her eyes. She was 23 years old. She'd spent her entire life on this land, and if she couldn't find a way to make that payment, the bank would take it all. The next morning, she rode into Silvage. The town clung to the eastern slope of the valley like a tick on a dog's ear, necessary perhaps, but not particularly welcome. Main Street ran north to south, lined with the usual collection of establishments: Hutchkin's General Store, the Rocky Mountain Saloon, the bank, the land office, the church. Residential streets branched off to either side where the families who ran the town lived in neat houses with painted shutters and flower gardens that seemed like small acts of defiance against the wild country surrounding them. Reese tied Ash outside the general store and ignored the stares that followed her. She'd grown used to them women gathering their skirts as if wildness might be contagious men, looking her up and down with expressions that ranged from disapproval to something uglier. She needed supplies. Flour, salt, coffee, a few other staples that would stretch their food stores another few weeks. She'd brought what money she could spare, counting out the coins 3 times before leaving the ranch. The bell above the door jangled as she entered. Bernard Hutchkins stood behind the counter, his expression souring the moment he saw her. "Miss Callahan." He didn't bother with warmth. "What can I do for you?" "Need some supplies, Mr. Hutchkins." She pulled the list from her pocket and set it on the counter. He glanced at it without picking it up. "You settling your father's account first?" Reese kept her voice level. "I paid $20 on it last month. Still leaves 43 outstanding." Hutchkins crossed his arms. "Store policy can't extend more credit until the account's settled." "Then I'll pay cash for what I need today." She pulled out her small leather purse and counted coins onto the counter. "That should cover the flour and salt at least." "Cash is fine." Hutchkins took the money, made a show of examining each coin, then began gathering her items with deliberate slowness. The store had 3 other customers. Reese felt their attention like pressure against her skin. Mrs. Eleanor Granger, the mayor's wife, stood near the fabric display with her daughter-in-law, both wearing expressions of pinched disapproval. A younger woman Reese didn't recognize browsed the canned goods, and near the back, examining a display of tools, stood a man Reese had never seen before. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders and the kind of weathered face that said he'd spent more time outdoors than in. His clothes were worn, but clean canvas pants, a faded blue shirt, boots that had seen serious miles. A hat hung down his back, revealing dark hair that needed cutting. He had maybe 10 years on her, putting him somewhere in his early 30s. What caught Reese's attention wasn't his appearance, but his stillness. He stood examining a hoof pick with the kind of complete focus most people reserved for something actually important, as if he had all the time in the world and no particular place to be. "I'm surprised you show your face in town, Miss Callahan." Eleanor Granger's voice carried across the store like a whip crack. Reese turned slowly. "Mrs. Granger, after the spectacle you made at the Johnsons' barn raising, I'd think you'd have the decency to keep to yourself." Eleanor adjusted her gloves with sharp, precise movements. "Wearing trousers, no less. Disgraceful." "They were split riding skirts, ma'am, and I was there to help raise a barn, not attend a tea party. A woman has no business." "A woman has business wherever she's needed," Reese cut her off. "The Johnsons needed hands. I have 2. Seems simple enough." Eleanor's face flushed. "Your poor father would be mortified." Something hot and sharp twisted in Reese's chest, but she forced her voice to stay calm. "My father taught me to judge people by their work, not their gossip. I'm grateful for the lesson." "Gossip," Eleanor drew herself up. "The entire town is concerned about your situation. A young woman, unmarried, running a ranch alone? It's unseemly, it's dangerous, and, frankly, it's evidence of poor judgment that should concern anyone thinking of doing business with you." "Then it's fortunate I don't need the town's approval to run my own land." "It's not your land, though, is it?" This came from Martha Granger, Eleanor's daughter-in-law, her voice syrupy with false sympathy. "Not really. Not until that banknote is settled, and we all know how unlikely that is." The store had gone completely silent. Reese met Martha's eyes directly. "I'll meet my obligations, Mrs. Granger." "Same as any man would." "But you're not a man." Eleanor again driving the point home. "That's precisely the issue. A woman simply cannot manage such affairs alone. It's not natural. Your father, God rest his soul, should have made provisions. Should have found you a husband, someone capable." "My father trusted me to make my own decisions." Reese's voice had gone quiet, which anyone who knew her would recognize as dangerous. "Including the decision of whether I need a husband. Need one or not, you'd be wise to find one before the bank takes everything." Eleanor's smile was thin and cold. "Several respectable men have expressed interest in acquiring your property. My nephew, for instance. He'd pay fair value, I'm sure, and you could move somewhere more appropriate for a woman alone." There it was, the real reason for this public performance. Eleanor's nephew, Curtis Granger, had been sniffing around the Callahan land for months, making increasingly insulting offers through his lawyers. The water rights alone were worth more than he'd ever proposed paying. "I'm not selling." Reese picked up the small bag of supplies Hutchkins had finally assembled. Not to your nephew, not to anyone. Pride goeth before a fall, Miss Callahan. Eleanor adjusted her handbag with a final dismissive gesture. Mark my words. Reese was halfway to the door when the stranger spoke. Ma'am. His voice was deep with the stretched vowels of Texas underneath. Reese stopped, turned. Up close, she could see his eyes were gray, like creek stones, and there was something in them that reminded her of Ash, calm, steady, waiting to see what came next before deciding how to react. I couldn't help overhearing. You running a ranch operation. Reese hesitated. I am. You hiring? The question caught her off guard. What for? Ranch work. I'm looking for a position. Heard there might be opportunities in this area. He said it matter-of-factly as if he hadn't just heard Eleanor Granger deliver her character assassination, as if the entire store wasn't staring. Eleanor made a sound of outrage. Young man, I feel obligated to warn you. Ma'am. He turned to her with exquisite politeness. I appreciate your concern, but I was addressing the lady who's actually hiring. Eleanor's mouth opened and closed. Martha grabbed her arm. The stranger turned back to Reese, waiting. She should say no. She didn't know this man didn't know if he could handle cattle or if he was just another drifter looking for easy wages and a place to sleep. She should be cautious, careful, smart, but the look on Eleanor Granger's face was worth every risk in the world. Maybe, Reese said, you got experience. Worked ranches in Texas, New Mexico territory, Wyoming. Can handle cattle, horses, fence work, whatever needs doing. Got my own gear, don't drink to excess, and I show up when I say I will. References. Last place I worked was the Triple Bar outside Cheyenne. Foreman was a man named Jacob Reeves. You know how to send a wire, he'll speak for me. Reese studied him. Everything about him said he was telling the truth. The calluses on his hands, the way he stood, the casual competence in how he had examined that hoof pick. What's your name? Clay Maddox. Where are you from, Mr. Maddox, most recently? Nowhere in particular. Originally, Yawa. Does it matter? Fair point. Out here, a man's past was his own business unless he made it otherwise. I can pay $30 a month plus board, Reese said. Works hard, hours are long. We're short-handed and behind on just about everything. Sounds like every ranch I've ever worked. I don't tolerate drinking, fighting, or disrespect. You do your job, keep your mouth shut about ranch business, and we'll get along fine. Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. Yes, ma'am. Don't ma'am me, I'm younger than you are. Boss, then. Miss Callahan works fine. Eleanor had recovered herself. Mr. Maddox, I really must insist you understand what you're walking into. This young woman is looking for ranch help, Clay interrupted, still polite but with steel underneath, which is her business and mine. Respectfully, ma'am, I don't see how it concerns you. Eleanor gasped. Martha looked like she might faint. Even Hutchkins seemed startled. Clay turned back to Reese. You want me to wire that reference or you want to see what I can do first and then decide? Reese made her decision. Ranch is 6 miles north of town, follow the creek road. You'll see the sign. Show up tomorrow morning dawn. Bring your gear. If you work out, we'll talk about making it permanent. Fair enough. He touched 2 fingers to where his hat would have been if he was wearing it. Tomorrow morning, then. Reese walked out of the store with her supplies and her dignity intact, feeling Eleanor Granger's fury like heat against her back. She didn't look back. Clay Maddox showed up the next morning before sunrise. Reese was already in the barn forking hay to the horses when she heard the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. She set down the pitchfork and walked out to find him dismounting from a sturdy-looking sorrel mare. His bedroll and saddlebags were tied behind his saddle, everything neat and compact. You're early, she said. Habit. He looked around the ranch, taking it in the house, the barn, the corral, the outbuildings. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes missed nothing. Where do you want me to start? Pete's not here yet, and Jimmy won't be in until this evening. How about you help me finish feeding, then we'll see about that south fence line. It needs work before we can move the cattle through. Lead the way. They worked in silence for the first hour. Clay moved like a man who'd spent his life around horses and hard work, efficient, competent, no wasted motion. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't offer unsolicited opinions, just did what needed doing. Pete Garza arrived as the sun was clearing the eastern peaks, riding his ancient mule and looking surprised to see a stranger in the barn. "Pete, this is Clay Maddox. He's on trial for ranch work." Clay P. Garza, best hand in 3 counties, even if he is too stubborn to admit he should have retired 5 years ago. Pete squinted at Clay, then at Reese, then back at Clay. "You know what you're getting into, son." "Getting a clearer picture every minute," Clay said. Pete snorted something that might have been a laugh. "Well, if you last longer than the others, I'll buy you a drink. If you don't save us both the trouble and leave quiet." They rode out to check the south fence after breakfast, Reese, Clay, and Pete on his mule. The morning was already heating up, promising another scorcher. The fence line ran along a rocky ridge that separated Callahan land from what had been open range, but was now claimed by Curtis Granger, Eleanor's nephew. He'd filed on it 6 months ago, right after Thomas Callahan died, a move everyone recognized as opportunistic, but no one could legally challenge. 3 sections of fence were down wire cut deliberately rather than broken by weather or animals. Reese dismounted and examined the cuts. "Third time this month." Pete swore in Spanish. Clay crouched beside her, running the wire through his fingers. His face was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, and recognition maybe, or suspicion. "Someone doesn't want this fence up." "Curtis Granger wants my water rights," Reese said. "Figures if he can push his cattle onto my land often enough, he can claim it's been open range all along." "You talk to the sheriff." "Sheriff Morehouse goes to Sunday dinner at the Granger house every week. What do you think he'd say?" Clay nodded slowly. "Understood." But as he stood examining the cut wire more closely, something in his expression shifted, a tightening around his eyes, a tension in his jaw. The way the wire had been cut was distinctive, deliberate, not the work of someone in a hurry, but someone with training, someone methodical. Clay had seen cuts like this before. 2 years ago, when he was still a Pinkerton detective tracking a gang that specialized in sabotage and intimidation. The wire had been cut exactly this way, a specific technique taught by an outlaw named Silas Crow, who trained half the criminals between Kansas and California before disappearing. Clay said nothing, but he filed the information away, a piece of a puzzle he hadn't expected to find here in this remote Colorado valley where he'd come to escape his past. They spent the morning repairing the fence, hot, brutal work, digging new post holes in rocky soil, stretching wire, making everything tight and true. Clay worked without complaint, matching Pete's pace despite the older man's obvious attempts to test him. Around noon, Reese rode back to the house to bring water and cold biscuits. When she returned, she found Pete and Clay finishing the last section, both of them sweat-soaked and dusty, but satisfied with the work. "Not bad," Pete admitted grudgingly. "You know your way around a fence, at least." "Built a few in my time." They ate lunch in the shade of a scrub oak, passing the water canteen and not talking much. Reese studied Clay when she thought he wasn't looking. He ate like a man who'd missed meals often enough to appreciate them when they came methodically without hurry, wasting nothing. "So what brings you to Colorado?" she asked finally. "Work." "That's not an answer." "It's the one I've got." He met her eyes directly. "I'm good at ranch work. I don't steal, don't start fights, and I keep my word. Past that, I don't see how my business concerns you." Pete made a sound of approval. Reese considered this. Everyone had their reasons for moving on, and out here most people had the good sense not to ask too many questions. "Fair enough, but I need to know if you're running from something that's going to show up at my door." "I'm not." "You're sure?" "I'm sure, Myron." She believed him. Maybe that made her a fool, but her father had always said you could tell more about a man by watching how he worked than by listening to what he said. Clay Maddox worked like someone who'd spent his life earning his keep honestly. "All right," she said. "You've got the job if you want it. 30 a month plus room and board. Bunkhouse is behind the barn, needs cleaning, but it's solid. You'll work with Pete and Jimmy, take direction from me, and help keep this ranch running. We clear." "We're clear." "Good. Welcome to the Callahan Ranch, Mr. Maddox." "Clay's fine." "Then it's Reese." Pete raised the water canteen in a mock toast. "God help us all." That evening, after Clay had settled into the bunkhouse and Pete had ridden home, Reese sat on the porch and watched the sunset behind the mountains. The air was finally cooling, bringing the smell of sage and pine down from the high country. As she cleaned her father's rifle, a ritual she performed every evening, she noticed something that had been nagging at her all day. During their ride back from the fence line, she caught Clay glancing toward the northern ridge where Anna Halverson's small farm sat in a fold of land mostly hidden from view. Pete had noticed her looking. "That's Anna Halverson," he'd said, his voice carefully neutral. "She's been watching over this place since your pa died. Strange woman, keeps to herself. I've never met her." "No reason you would have. She doesn't come to town much." "Why does she watch the ranch?" Pete had shrugged. "Your pa helped her with things over the years. Fixed her barn roof, brought her supplies during bad winters. Never asked for anything in return. I reckon she feels she owes him." But there had been something in Pete's tone that suggested there was more to the story, something he wasn't saying. Reese thought about it now, watching the last light fade from the sky. Her father had been a good man, always willing to help a neighbor. But there had been a sadness in him sometimes, especially when he looked at the small portrait of Reese's mother that sat on the mantel, a sadness that went deeper than grief. She'd never understood it as a child. Now sitting alone on the porch of the house he'd built, she wondered what other secrets her father had carried. In the bunkhouse, Clay Maddox lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. His saddlebag sat on the floor beside him, and in the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was something he hadn't looked at in 2 years, a small daguerreotype of a child. Sarah Mitchell, 8 years old, brown curls and a gap-toothed smile. Dead because Clay had been 5 minutes too late. He'd been a Pinkerton detective, then hired to protect a rancher's family from a gang that had been terrorizing the territory. Clay had tracked the gang for weeks, getting closer, building a case. He'd assured the family they were safe, that he had everything under control. Then one night, while Clay was in town following a lead the gang had struck, they'd killed the rancher, his wife, and little Sarah. By the time Clay arrived, the house was burning and the gang was gone. The Mitchell's older son, 12-year-old Thomas, had survived by hiding in the root cellar. The last thing Clay had seen was the boy's face hollow with shock and grief as the neighbors led him away. Clay had turned in his Pinkerton badge the next day. He couldn't carry a badge that represented protection when he'd failed so completely. For 2 years he'd drifted, working ranches, moving on before anyone could ask questions, trying to outrun the guilt that followed him like a shadow. Then 3 days ago he'd walked into Hutchkins' General Store in Silvage and heard Eleanor Granger calling Reese Callahan wild and unfit. He'd seen Reese standing there chin up, refusing to break under the weight of the entire town's disapproval. And something in him, something he'd thought died with Sarah Mitchell, had stirred back to life. Maybe he'd thought if he couldn't save that family, he could help save this one. Maybe after 2 years of running, he'd finally found a reason to stay. He didn't let himself think about what would happen if Reese ever learned the truth about who he really was or what he was running from. For now, it was enough to work to be useful, to feel like maybe, just maybe, he could do something right for once. Clay closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the image of cut fence wire kept appearing in his mind. That specific technique, Silas Crow's signature. If Crow or his people were in this valley working for Curtis Granger, then this was about more than just land and water rights. It was about something darker, something criminal. And Clay Maddox, who'd sworn never to be a detective again, felt the old instincts stirring. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he'd start paying closer attention. The next 3 weeks fell into a pattern. Clay proved himself worth every penny of his wages and then some. He worked from dawn to well past dusk, never complaining, always finding the next task that needed doing. He repaired the barn roof, cleared brush from around the house, helped Pete move cattle to better grazing, and fixed things that had been broken so long Reese had stopped noticing them. He didn't talk much, but when he did, he was direct and honest. He treated Reese exactly like what she was, his boss, without the undercurrent of resentment or superiority that had poisoned her relationships with other hired hands. Pete won over despite his initial skepticism, started teaching Clay the quirks of the Callahan operation, which cattle were trouble, where the creek ran strongest, which sections of fence needed checking most often. Jimmy, when he was there, watched Clay with cautious curiosity, but slowly began to trust him too. And Reese found herself grateful in ways she hadn't expected. Not just for the work Clay did, but for the way his presence changed the atmosphere of the ranch. With 4 of them working, even if Jimmy was only there part-time, the place felt less like a losing battle and more like something that might actually survive. But the calendar kept moving forward, each day bringing her closer to that deadline. 45 days left. 40, 35. She sold another 6 head of cattle to pay for supplies and put a little aside for the note. It wasn't nearly enough. The harassment from Curtis Granger continued. More cut fences, cattle driven onto her land and left there, forcing her to spend time rounding them up and driving them back. Small acts of sabotage that cost her time and money she couldn't afford to lose. Clay never said much about it, but Reese noticed he'd started carrying a rifle when they rode fence line. And he had a way of watching the horizon that suggested he was used to trouble finding him. One afternoon, they were riding back from checking the north pasture when he finally spoke about it. "This Curtis Granger," he said, "he dangerous or just annoying?" "Both, probably. He's got money influence and the sheriff in his pocket. He wants this land bad enough to make my life miserable until I sell." "But you're not selling." "No. Even if it means losing everything." Reese pulled Ash to a stop and turned to look at Clay directly. "My father broke his back building this place. He gave me everything he had, his land, his knowledge, his faith that I could handle it. I'm not selling to Curtis Granger or anyone else just because they think a woman can't run a ranch." Clay held her gaze. He wasn't judging, just making sure he understood the situation. "And now that you do, now I know what I'm working for," he said. "Makes it clearer." They rode in silence for a while, the afternoon heat pressing down on them. "Can I ask you something?" Reese said finally. "Sure. Why'd you take this job? You could work anywhere. Must have seen I was in trouble the minute you laid eyes on the place." Clay was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Maybe that's why I took it." "That doesn't make sense." "Doesn't have to." He adjusted his hat against the sun. "You needed help. I needed work. Seemed like a fair trade. Most men wouldn't work for a woman, especially not one the whole town's talking about. Most men are fools." It surprised a laugh out of her. "Pete would agree with you." "Pete's smart." They rode on and Reese found herself oddly comforted. In a world where everyone seemed determined to tell her what she couldn't do, Clay Maddox simply showed up and did what needed doing. No judgment, no lectures, no assumptions, just work. Chia. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger again running the numbers for the 100th time. No matter how she calculated it, the answer was the same: she was going to be at least $70 short when that note came due. She could sell more cattle, but she'd already sold enough that she was cutting into next year's breeding stock. Sell much more, and there wouldn't be a ranch worth saving. She could take out another loan, but who would give her one? Not the bank, not anyone in town. She was still working when Clay appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "Saw your light on, wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Fine as it ever is." She closed the ledger. "Something you need." He hesitated, then stepped inside. "I was talking with Jimmy earlier. He mentioned that buyer in Cheyenne." "What about it?" "Said you dismissed the idea. Too risky, not enough hands." "That's right." Clay pulled out a chair and sat down without asking permission, which should have annoyed her, but somehow didn't. "You know what's risky? Sitting here waiting for the bank to take everything." "I'm not sitting here doing nothing." "No, you're working yourself to death, trying to hold on by your fingernails." "But the numbers don't add up, do they? You're going to come up short no matter how hard you work." Reese felt her jaw tighten. "You've been here 3 weeks, and you think you know." "I think I can count," Clay interrupted, "and I think you're too proud to admit when you need to take a bigger risk. Driving cattle 200 miles with 3 hands and a part-timer isn't a risk. It's suicide. 4 hands if I go, 5 if Jimmy can get free for the trip. We'd have to leave the ranch unguarded. Curtis Granger would. Curtis Granger is going to take it anyway unless you make that payment." Clay leaned forward, his gray eyes serious. "I know it's not my place. I'm just hired help, and you've got every right to tell me to mind my own business. But if you've got a better plan, I'd like to hear it." Reese wanted to argue, wanted to find some flaw in his logic, some reason to reject the idea that had been gnawing at her since Jimmy first mentioned it. But she couldn't, because he was right. "Even if we tried," she said slowly, "we'd need at least a 40 head to make it worth the trip. That's almost everything I have left. High risk, high reward. If we lose them, weather thieves stampede anything, I'm ruined. And if you don't try, you're ruined anyway." She stared at the closed ledger, seeing her father's handwriting in her mind. The careful notes he'd made about each season's work, each small success and setback. He'd been a careful man, measured and deliberate, but he'd also been willing to bet everything on this land when everyone told him it was foolish. Maybe caution wasn't what this moment required. "I need to know more about the route," she heard herself say. "Timeline risks where we can find water and grass. And I'd need a straight answer about whether you really think we could make it with this few people." Clay nodded slowly. "I've made that run before. It's hard, but it's doable. The key is moving fast enough to beat the weather, but slow enough not to wear down the herd. With 4 people pushing hard, maybe 5. If Jimmy can come, yeah, I think we could do it." Think or know. Nobody knows anything in this business, but I think our chances are better on the trail than sitting here watching the calendar run out. Reese stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark shapes of the mountains against the star-filled sky. Her father had loved this view, had stood in this exact spot 1,000 times, planning and dreaming and building something from nothing. She turned back to Clay. "All right," she said. "Tell me everything." They talked until well past midnight, mapping out a plan that was audacious and probably foolish, but just might save everything. And Reese Callahan, the woman Silvage had decided was too wild and too stubborn to succeed, began to believe she might prove them all wrong after all. The plan took shape over the next 4 days, like a storm building on the horizon, inevitable, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. Clay spread a hand-drawn map across the kitchen table, his finger tracing the road north. 200 miles, give or take. We follow the creek roads for the first 50, then cut across open country here. He tapped a section of the map. There's a series of streams that'll give us water most of the way, but this section, he indicated a blank space. That's 30 miles of dry country. We'll need to push through it in one long haul. Reese studied the map, committing every detail to memory. How long? 10 days if everything goes right. 12 if we hit trouble. Any longer than that and we're cutting it too close to your deadline. And if we hit serious trouble, Clay met her eyes, then we deal with it. Pete, who'd been listening from his seat by the stove, snorted. "You're both crazy. 40 head with 4 people through country that'll kill you if the weather doesn't cooperate. This is how people lose everything." "I'm already losing everything," Reese said quietly. "At least this way I'm fighting back." The old man was silent for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "Your father would have done the same damn thing. Doesn't mean it's smart." "Will you come?" Pete looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw something shift behind his weathered eyes. "Hell, girl, you know I will." Jimmy arrived that evening with news that changed everything. His father had agreed to let him go on the drive, and more than that, he'd offered something unexpected. "My cousin Lee works at the feed store in Cheyenne," Jimmy said, standing in the barn while they sorted tack. "He knows the buyers there. Says there's a man named Dalton Hughes who pays top dollar for good beef supplies, the mining camps, and the railroad crews. If we can get the herd there in decent condition, Lee can make an introduction." Clay looked up from the saddle he was oiling. "That's better than walking in blind and hoping for the best." "It's also putting a lot of faith in connections we haven't tested," Reese pointed out. "You got a better option?" Pete asked. She didn't. They spent the next week preparing in a silence broken only by necessary communication. Every decision felt weighted with consequence. Which cattle to take the strongest, but that meant leaving the breeding stock vulnerable. How much supplies to pack enough to sustain them, but not so much it slowed them down. What to do about the ranch while they were gone? That last question kept Reese awake at night. "Curtis Granger will know the minute we leave," she said to Clay one evening as they reinforced the gate on the main corral. "He'll have people watching. The second we drive that herd north, he'll move in." "Can't be helped." Clay tested the gate, satisfied with its strength. "You want to leave someone behind? With what we need, every hand on the trail. Then we secure what we can accept, what we can't control, and move fast enough that he doesn't have time to do real damage." Reese hammered in a final nail with more force than necessary. "I hate leaving this place undefended." "I know." Clay's voice was quieter. "But sometimes you have to risk what you've got to keep it." She looked at him across the corral gate, the stranger who'd walked into her life a month ago and somehow become essential to its survival. "You talk like a man who's lost things before." "Everyone's lost things." He picked up his tools. "Question is what you do after." The night before they were set to leave, Reese walked the ranch alone. She checked every building, every fence line she could see in the moonlight, every corner of the property her father had built from nothing. The cottonwoods whispered overhead, their leaves silver green in the pale light. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, answered by another, farther off. She ended up at her father's grave, a simple marker on a rise overlooking the valley. Someone, probably Pete, had placed fresh wildflowers there recently. "I'm gambling everything you built," she said to the weathered stone. "I hope that's what you would have wanted. I hope I'm not making the biggest mistake of my life." The night gave her no answers, just the sound of wind through grass and the distant murmur of the creek. She was walking back to the house when she saw Clay sitting on the porch steps, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. He shook his head, made room for her on the step. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the moon tracker cross the square. "You ever done something this risky?" Reese asked finally. "Once or twice." "How'd it turn out?" Clay was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then mixed. "Sometimes you win, sometimes you learn." "That's not comforting." Wasn't trying to be comforting, was trying to be honest. He took a sip of coffee. "You want comfort, you're in the wrong business." Despite everything, Reese smiled. "Pete's right, you're crazy. Takes one to know one." They sat there until the coffee went cold and the moon set behind the western peaks, two people about to bet everything on a trail drive that could save a ranch or destroy it completely. When Reese finally went to bed, she slept better than she had in weeks. They left at dawn with 42 head of cattle, 4 horses, and everything they owned tied to their saddles. The herd moved slow, at first reluctant to leave familiar grazing. Clay and Pete worked the flanks while Jimmy rode drag, eating dust, but never complaining. Reese took point, setting the pace and watching for trouble. The first day was chaos. Cattle broke from the group, doubled back, tested every weakness in their formation. By noon, Reese's voice was hoarse from shouting, and her shoulders ached from constant tension. But gradually, slowly, the herd began to settle into a rhythm. They learned to follow the lead steer, a massive longhorn Clay had identified as their best bet for keeping order. The cattle understood they were moving with purpose now, not just being harried aimlessly. They made 8 miles that first day, stopping in a meadow where the creek ran wide and shallow. While the cattle grazed and drank, the 4 of them set up a minimal camp bedrolls arranged around a small fire. Horses picketed nearby, one person always on watch. Pete took first watch. Jimmy collapsed into his bedroll and was asleep in minutes. Clay checked the horses one more time, then settled near the fire with his rifle across his knees. Reese poured coffee from the pot they'd suspended over the flames and handed him a cup. "First day is always the hardest," he said. "That's supposed to make me feel better." "No, it's supposed to prepare you for tomorrow." She laughed despite her exhaustion. "You're terrible at encouragement." Never claimed otherwise. But there was warmth in his eyes, something that made her chest feel less tight. They drank their coffee and watched the fire burn down to embers, neither feeling the need to fill the silence with unnecessary words. The second day was better. The cattle had learned the routine and they covered nearly 12 miles before stopping. The third day, 13. They were making good time, better than Reese had dared hope. But the land was changing. The easy creek valleys were giving way to rougher country rocky ground that punished the cattle's hooves, scattered timber that made keeping the herd together, harder slopes that slowed their progress to a crawl. On the 4th day, they lost a calf to a cougar. Pete found the kill just after dawn, the small body already cold. "Could have been worse," he said, but his face was grim. "Could have been a full-grown steer. Could have scattered the whole herd." They pushed on. That afternoon, they encountered their first real obstacle, a section of the trail that had washed out in spring floods, leaving a gap too wide for the cattle to cross safely. Clay rode ahead to scout while the others held the herd. He came back an hour later with a new route that added 3 miles to their journey but looked passable. "It'll cost us half a day," he said, "but it's better than losing cattle trying to force them across bad ground." Reese made the call. They took the long way. The detour was harder than Clay's scouting had suggested. The ground was treacherous, full of hidden holes and loose rock. They had to move the herd in small groups, painstaking and slow, while the sun hammered down and the dust rose in choking clouds. Jimmy's horse stumbled, nearly throwing him. Pete's mule balked at a narrow section and had to be coaxed across with language that would have made a saloon blush. One of the steers panicked halfway through and tried to bolt back, triggering a small stampede that cost them an hour of backtracking. By the time they got the entire herd across, the sun was setting and they were all beyond exhausted. They made camp in a small canyon that offered some protection from the wind. The cattle, stressed and irritable, took longer than usual to settle. Reese rode the perimeter until full dark, checking for strays and predators, her body moving on instinct while her mind cataloged everything that had gone wrong. When she finally dismounted, her legs nearly buckled. Clay appeared at her elbow, steadying her. "Easy. I'm fine. You're running on fumes." He took Ash's reins. "I'll handle your horse. You eat something." She wanted to argue, but the smell of Pete's cooking beans and salt pork, nothing fancy but hot and filling, made her stomach clench with hunger. Jimmy had already eaten and taken first watch. Pete was cleaning the pan, his movements slow and careful in the way of a man feeling every one of his years. Reese accepted a plate and sat heavily on a rock near the fire. Clay joined her a few minutes later, his own plate balanced on his knee. They ate in silence, too tired for conversation. "We're behind schedule," Reese said finally. "Half a day. We can make it up. How push harder tomorrow. The ground gets easier once we're past these foothills." "And if it doesn't," Clay set down his empty plate and looked at her directly. "Then we adjust. That's all you can do out here. Deal with what comes and keep moving forward." Spoken like a man who's done a lot of moving forward. Spoken like a man who knows there's no point in looking back. There was something in his voice, some edge of old pain, that made Reese look at him more closely. In the firelight, his face was all shadow and sharp angles, his eyes distant. "Clay, get some sleep," he interrupted, standing. "I'll take second watch after Pete." He walked away before she could say anything else, disappearing into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. Reese stared after him, piecing together the fragments of the man she'd hired on instinct and desperation. A good worker who didn't ask for much. A skilled cowhand who knew routes and trails like he'd spent his life wandering. Someone who deflected personal questions with the ease of long practice. Someone running from something, or towards something, or maybe just running. She wondered what his story was. Then she wondered if it mattered. Out here on this trail with everything on the line, and all that mattered was whether he'd stand when things got hard. She had a feeling she already knew the answer to that. The next morning brought new trouble in the form of weather. Reese woke to find the sky gone gray and heavy clouds building in the north like a promise of rain. The air had that electric quality that came before storms, making the horses nervous and the cattle restless. "We need to move," Clay said, already saddling his mare. "If that storm catches us in the open, we're in trouble." They pushed the herd hard, covering ground faster than was wise, but knowing they had no choice. The storm was building at their backs, turning the northern sky the color of old bruises. By midday, the first drops started to fall. By afternoon, it was a deluge. Rain came down in sheets, turning the trail to mud and reducing visibility to almost nothing. The cattle balked, trying to turn back towards shelter that didn't exist. Lightning cracked overhead, brilliant and terrifying, followed by thunder that rolled across the landscape like artillery fire. "Keep them moving," Reese shouted, but her voice was lost in the storm. A bolt of lightning struck close enough that she felt it in her teeth, and the herd broke. 42 head of cattle, panicked and blind, scattered across the landscape in pure terror. Reese saw Jimmy's horse rear, saw Pete nearly go down as his mule spun. She fought to control Ash while trying to track which direction the cattle were running. Clay appeared out of the rain like a ghost, his mare dancing sideways. "South," he shouted. "They're heading south. Get ahead of them. Turn them." He was gone before she finished speaking, racing into the storm. Reese followed, trusting Ash to find his footing on the treacherous ground. Rain hammered into her face, cold and brutal. She could barely see, navigating by sound and instinct, following the thunder of hooves ahead. She found Clay a quarter-mile south, trying to turn the lead cattle back north. He was alone, one man against a stampede, and it wasn't working. Reese pulled her rifle from its scabbard and fired into the air. Once, twice, 3 times. The shots cut through the storm, sharp and commanding. The lead steer hesitated. Clay saw the opening and pushed his mare forward, cutting across the steer's path, forcing it to turn. The animal swung north, and the others began to follow their panic, giving way to confusion. Pete and Jimmy appeared from different directions, helping to contain the herd and keep them moving together. Slowly, painfully, they regained control. The storm lasted another hour, then passed as quickly as it had come, leaving them soaked and shivering in a landscape transformed to mud. They spent the rest of the daylight accounting for the herd. 39 head. They'd lost 3 in the chaos scattered somewhere in the miles of rough country they'd just crossed. Reese wanted to go back to search until they found every missing animal. But Clay shook his head. We can't afford the time. And in this mud, trying to track them is more likely to cost us horses than find us cattle. Those steers represent money we need, and they're gone. His voice was gentle but firm. I'm sorry, but we have to keep moving with what we have. She knew he was right, hated it, but knew it. They made camp that evening in silence, everyone too exhausted for conversation. Reese's hands shook as she tried to build a fire with wet wood. Clay took over, without comment, coaxing flames from material that seemed determined not to burn. When they finally had coffee and something resembling warmth, Pete spoke for the first time in hours. Lost 3 head, gained a lesson. He stared into the fire. Could have been worse. How, Jimmy asked. Could have lost all of them. Could have lost a horse. Could have lost one of us. The old man looked around at their wet, exhausted faces. Out here, you measure success by what you keep, not what you lose. That night, unable to sleep, Reese walked the perimeter of their camp for the 3rd time. The ground squelched under her boots, and the air smelled of wet earth and cattle. Overhead, the clouds had cleared enough to show scattered stars. She found Clay on watch, sitting on a boulder, with his rifle across his knees, looking north toward their destination. Can't sleep, he asked without turning. Can't stop thinking. She climbed up to sit beside him. About the 3 we lost, about everything. That's a lot of thinking. I'm good at it. Clay smiled slightly. I've noticed. They sat in silence for a while, watching the night. My father used to say that ranching was just a series of disasters interrupted by brief moments of success. Reese said, I never really understood what he meant until now. Sounds like a smart man. He was. She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. He believed in this land, believed it could support us if we were willing to work hard enough. And I want to prove him right. I want to show everyone who doubted him, who doubts me, that we can make this work. You will. You sound pretty confident for a man who's known me all of 5 weeks. I've seen how you work, how you think, how you don't quit even when quitting would be easier. Clay turned to look at her. That counts for more than time. Something in his voice made her chest tight. Thank you, she said quietly, for backing me. That rifle cocking at exactly the right moment back at the Crown Ranch cutoff that made the difference. Figured you needed the support. I did. She paused, then added, I do. More than I realized. Clay was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, become more careful. Reese, when this is over, when you make that payment and save the ranch, what happens then? What do you mean, boy? I mean, with the work, with the crew. He wasn't looking at her, his eyes on the distant horizon. I signed on for a temporary position. Didn't expect it to become this. Reese's heart did something complicated in her chest. Are you saying you want to leave? I'm saying I don't know what I want. He finally turned to face her. I've been moving for a long time. Staying in one place, building something permanent, that's not who I've been. But it could be who you are now. Could be. He smiled, but there was something sad in it. If I knew how. You just decide, Reese said, hearing the vulnerability in her own voice and not trying to hide it. You choose to stay instead of choosing to go. Is it really that simple? Nothing simple, but yes, sometimes it comes down to a choice. She paused. I hope you choose to stay. After all this, I can't imagine running the ranch without you. The words hung in the air between them, meaning more than either was quite ready to acknowledge. Let's get through the next few days first, Clay said finally. Then we'll see what choices make sense. It wasn't the answer Reese wanted, but it was honest, and she respected that. They sat together through the rest of the watch, and if they sat a little closer than necessary, neither mentioned it. They reached the dry section on the 7th day, and it was every bit as brutal as Clay had warned. 30 miles of nothing, no water, no shade, no relief from the sun that beat down like a hammer on an anvil. They started the crossing at dusk, planning to move through the night when it was cooler, rest during the worst heat of the day, then push through to water on the far side. The cattle understood something was wrong. They moved reluctantly, sensing the absence of water fighting every step. Reese's throat was dust dry within hours. They'd rationed water carefully, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough in this landscape that seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to cross it. Jimmy's lips cracked and bled. Pete developed a cough that rattled in his chest. Clay's face was burned despite his hat, his eyes bloodshot and shadowed. And the cattle were suffering worse. Their tongues swollen, their movements sluggish. "We're not going to make it in one push," Reese said when the sun came up, revealing the empty miles still ahead. "We have to," Clay rasped. "If we stop here, we lose them. If we keep pushing, we lose them anyway." They argued in harsh whispers while the cattle stood with lowered heads, their flanks heaving. Pete ended the debate by simply sitting down in the dust. "Rest," he said. 2 hours, then we move again." They gave the cattle the last of their water, watching the animals drink desperately from buckets that emptied too fast. When they started moving again, Reese counted 37 head. 2 had gone down during the rest, too weak to continue. She'd made the decision to leave them, the hardest call of her life, knowing that stopping to help them would doom the rest. The final stretch was a blur of heat and dust and the taste of failure in her mouth. She stopped thinking, stopped planning, just kept moving because stopping meant dying. When they finally reached for water, a clear stream running through a cottonwood grove, Reese slid from Ash's back and fell to her knees, drinking until her stomach cramped. The cattle stampeded for the water, no longer controllable, no longer caring about anything except survival. They'd made it. Barely. 37 head remained, and everyone was half dead from the crossing. But they'd made it. That night, with the sound of running water, the most beautiful thing Reese had ever heard, Clay found her sitting by the stream. 2 more days, he said, settling beside her. Maybe 3. Then we're there. Reese looked at him, this man who'd appeared in her life at exactly the right moment, who'd never wavered even when common sense said he should run. "Thank you for staying, for believing this was possible when I wasn't sure I did. Thank you for what? For staying, for believing this was possible when I wasn't sure I did." Clay sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "We're not there yet." "No, but we're close." Reese thought about her father, about the ranch waiting behind them, and the buyers waiting ahead, about everything riding on the next few days. "Close enough to start hoping." "Yeah," Clay said quietly. "Close enough for that." The water ran silver in the moonlight, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a nightbird called. They sat together in the darkness, 2 people who'd gambled everything on a trail that had nearly killed them, gathering strength for the final push that would determine whether they lost it all or saved everything that mattered. They gave the cattle 2 full days to recover by the stream, and Reese spent every hour of that time fighting the urge to push forward. The calendar was ticking in her head like a clock counting down to disaster. They had 6 days left before the banknote came due, and they were still 2 hard days from Cheyenne. But Clay was right when he said rushing now would cost them everything. The cattle needed to regain their strength, or they'd arrive looking half dead, and no buyer would pay top dollar for animals that looked like they'd barely survived the journey. So Reese waited, pacing the camp like a caged animal, while Pete and Jimmy tended the herd, and Clay disappeared for hours at a time, scouting the route ahead. On the second evening by the stream, he returned with news that made her stomach clench. "There's a ranch about 10 miles north," he said, swinging down from his mare. "Big operation. I saw riders on the ridge watching our camp." "Watching where?" Reese looked toward the northern hills. "Why, could be just curious. Could be they don't like strangers moving cattle through their territory." Clay unsaddled his horse with quick, efficient movements. "Either way, we need to be careful." Pete spat into the fire. "Cattle thieves, maybe, or just territorial ranchers who think they own everything they can see." Clay glanced at Reese. "How much do we have in the way of weapons?" 3 rifles, 2 pistols. Not much ammunition. Might be enough to discourage trouble. Might not." He sat down heavily, accepting the coffee Jimmy poured for him. "We move out at first light. Keep the herd tight and don't give anyone an excuse to start something." That night, they doubled the watch. Reese took the midnight shift, sitting with her father's rifle across her knees and watching the darkness for movement that didn't belong. The cattle were settled, their breathing a steady rhythm in the quiet. The horses drowsed in their picket line. Everything looked peaceful, but Reese couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her back. When Clay came to relieve her at 2 in the morning, she almost didn't want to leave her post. Nothing yet, she said, handing him the rifle. Good. He settled into position, his eyes already scanning the perimeter. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long. She started toward her bedroll, then stopped. Clay, if there's trouble, we handle it. His voice was calm, matter of fact, same as everything else. I need these cattle to reach Cheyenne. I can't afford to lose any more. I know. So if someone tries to take them, Reese? He turned to look at her, his face serious in the starlight. I've been in this business long enough to know when to fight and when to walk away. If trouble comes, we'll make the right call. I promise you that. She wanted more reassurance, wanted guarantees that didn't exist out here, where everything came down to luck and timing and the willingness to defend what was yours. But promises were all anyone could offer, and Clay's word had been good so far. All right, she said. Wake me if anything changes. Sleep came hard and left early. Reese woke before dawn to find the camp already stirring, everyone moving with the quiet tension of people expecting trouble. They got the herd moving as the sun broke over the eastern peaks. 37 head of cattle that represented everything Reese owned and more than she could afford to lose. The animals were stronger after their rest, moving with better energy, but they were still lean and trail-worn. The morning passed without incident. They made good time across rolling grassland, following a wagon road that showed signs of regular use. Around midday, they spotted riders on a distant ridge, 4 men on horseback sitting motionless and watching. Don't react, Clay said quietly, riding close to Reese. Keep moving like we've got every right to be here. Do we? This is open range near as I can tell. We're not on anyone's deed land. He adjusted his hat, a casual gesture that somehow conveyed complete alertness. But that doesn't mean they won't try to claim otherwise. The riders stayed on the ridge, paralleling their route, but making no move to approach. It was more unnerving than if they'd ridden down to challenge them directly. By late afternoon, the watchers had grown to 6 men, and they were getting closer. They're going to make a move, Pete said, riding up beside Reese. His hand rested on the rifle scabbard at his knee. Question is when and how. Jimmy, close up the drag, Reese called. Keep them tight. The young man nodded and pushed his horse forward, crowding the cattle into a more compact group. It would slow them down, but it would also make the herd harder to split or scatter. The sun was touching the western horizon when the riders finally came down from the ridge. They spread out in a loose line across the trail ahead, forcing Reese to either stop the herd or push through them. She raised her hands, signaling a halt, and the cattle milled uncertainly behind her. The lead rider was a big man with a thick beard and cold eyes. He sat his horse with the confidence of someone used to getting his way through sea and intimidation. This is private range, he said without preamble. You're trespassing. Reese kept her voice level. We're following the public road, not bothering anyone, just passing through. Road runs through deed land for the next 5 miles, belongs to the Crown Ranch. He spat tobacco juice into the dust. You want to move cattle through, there's a toll. How much? Clay asked, his tone neutral. The big man's eyes shifted to him, assessing. 10 head seems fair. Pete swore in Spanish. Jimmy's horse danced sideways, picking up on the tension. That's not a toll, Reese said coldly. That's robbery. Call it what you want. The man smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. 10 head or you turn around and find another route. And if we refuse, then we take them anyway and you get nothing for your trouble but a hard lesson about whose country this is. The other 5 riders had spread out, flanking them on both sides. They were armed, rifles and pistols, visible hands resting casually near weapons. Reese did the math quickly. 4 against 6, and her people were exhausted from 9 days on the trail. Even if they wanted to fight, the odds were terrible. And if shooting started, the cattle would scatter, and they'd lose everything anyway. But 10 head was more than a quarter of what they had left. It would gut the profit margin so badly that even if they sold in Cheyenne, she might not have enough to make the bank payment. We need a minute to discuss this, she said. The big man shrugged. Take your time. We're not going anywhere. Reese rode back to where Clay, Pete, and Jimmy waited, keeping her voice low. Options. Fight and probably lose, Pete said bluntly. Give them what they want and definitely lose, Jimmy added. There's a third option, Clay said. We go around. You said the deed land runs 5 miles. That would add at least a day to our journey, maybe more. Maybe, but we'd keep all our cattle. We don't have a day to spare, Reese said. We're already cutting it close. The three men looked at her, waiting for her decision. Every choice led to loss. The only question was what kind. She turned Ash back toward the confrontation, a plan forming that was either brilliant or suicidal. "Here's my counter-offer," she said to the bearded man. "We're going through. We're not paying a toll, and we're not turning around. And in exchange, I'm not going to report to the territorial marshal that the Crown Ranch is extorting travelers on public roads." His expression darkened. "You don't even know if there's a marshal in these parts." "True, but you don't know that there isn't." Reese leaned forward in her saddle. "And even if there's not, I can make enough noise about this that the Crown Ranch gets a reputation for robbery. That'll hurt your boss's business a lot more than letting one herd pass through peacefully." The man studied her, trying to decide if she was bluffing. Behind her, Reese heard the quiet click of a rifle being cocked, Clay backing her play. The standoff stretched for what felt like an hour but was probably less than a minute. Finally, the bearded man hawked and spat again. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. Stupid guts, but guts. So we can pass." He hesitated, and Reese saw the calculation in his eyes, weighing the trouble of a fight against the trouble of explaining to his boss why he'd let them through. Then something changed in his expression. He was looking past Reese directly at Clay, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Maddox," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "Pinkerton Maddox." Reese's breath caught. She glanced back at Clay, but his face was unreadable. "Let them through, Silas," Clay said quietly. The bearded man Silas stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "You've got until dark to clear Crown land," he said, his voice different now, less aggressive, almost respectful. "After that, anything we find is fair game." It wasn't permission, but it was enough. "Understood," Reese said. "We'll be gone before you know it." The riders moved aside, opening a gap in their line just wide enough for the cattle to pass through. Reese signaled to the others, and they started the herd moving again, everyone keeping their hands visible and their weapons ready. They passed between the Crown riders in tense silence, close enough that Reese could smell the tobacco and sweat coming off the bearded man. He watched her with an expression that promised he'd remember this encounter. She didn't look back. They pushed the cattle hard after that, moving faster than was wise in the fading light, but no one argued. The Crown riders stayed on the ridge behind them, watching until darkness made them invisible. Only when they had put 10 miles between themselves and the confrontation did Reese finally signal a halt. They made camp in a small canyon that offered some protection, posting a double watch and keeping the fire small. No one spoke much. They were all too wrung out from the adrenaline crash. Pete finally broke the silence while they were choking down a cold dinner of jerky and hardtack. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the dumbest," he said to Reese. "Haven't decided which." "Both, probably," she admitted. "You know they could have just shot us and taken everything." "I know. So why didn't they—" Reese thought about it, trying to put into words the instinct that had guided her. "Because men like that are used to people backing down. They weren't expecting someone to call their bluff." "What if it wasn't a bluff? Then we'd be dead and it wouldn't matter anyway." Clay laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Your father teach you to gamble like that. My father taught me that bullies back down if you stand up to them, even when you're scared." "Were you scared?" "Terrified." Reese met his eyes across the small fire, but they didn't need to know that. Later, when she took her watch shift, Clay joined her without being asked. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the night sounds of the canyon. "You handled that well today," he said eventually. "We're still alive and we still have our cattle. I'll take it. It was more than that. You read the situation, made a call, and stuck with it. That takes nerve." Reese turned to look at him. "You keep talking like you're surprised I can handle myself." "Not surprised, impressed." His voice was quiet, honest. "There's a difference." Something warm unfurled in her chest, unexpected and a little frightening. "Thank you," she said, "for backing me. That rifle cocking at exactly the right moment, that made the difference. Figured you needed the support." "I did." She paused. "I do. More than I realize." Clay was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, become more careful. "Reese, there's something I need to tell you about what happened back there. About who I am." Her heart started beating faster. "All right." That man, Silas, he recognized me because I used to be a Pinkerton detective. Before I started drifting, before I came here, that was my life. Why'd you leave? Clay was silent for so long, she thought he might not answer. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, because I failed someone. Someone who needed protecting, and I was 5 minutes too late. He told her then about Sarah Mitchell, about the family he'd been hired to protect, about the gang that had killed them while Clay was in town following a lead, about the guilt that had driven him to turn in his badge and spend 2 years wandering, trying to outrun the memory of a little girl's face. I couldn't carry a badge that represented protection when I'd failed so completely, he said. So I walked away, told myself I was done being responsible for people's lives. But you came here, Reese said softly. You took a job protecting a ranch, protecting me. Yeah, he finally looked at her. I heard Eleanor Granger calling you wild and unfit, saw you standing there refusing to break, and I thought maybe I could help someone this time. Maybe I could finally do something right. Reese reached out and took his hand. You did save someone, Clay. You saved me. They sat there in the darkness, hands clasped, and Reese understood suddenly why he'd been so careful about promises, so hesitant about staying. He was a man who'd lost faith in his ability to keep people safe. And she was asking him to build something permanent, to put down roots, to risk caring about something enough that losing it would hurt. I'm glad you're here, she said. I'm glad you chose to stay even for a little while. Me too. The next day brought them to the outskirts of Cheyenne. The city sprawled across the plains like something that had grown too fast to contain, buildings crowding together in haphazard patterns, streets churned to mud by constant traffic. The smell of coal smoke and livestock and human industry thick in the air. Reese had been to Cheyenne exactly once when she was 12, and her father had brought her to sell horses. She remembered being overwhelmed by the noise, the crowds, the sense of barely controlled chaos. 10 years later, the city had tripled in size, fed by the railroad and the mining camps, and the endless westward push of people looking for fortune or escape or just somewhere to be. They drove the cattle to the stockyards on the south edge of town where pens stood ready to receive herds from across the territory. A man with a clipboard and a bored expression directed them to an available section. You selling or holding, he asked. Selling, Reese said. Looking for a buyer named Dalton Hughes. The man's eyebrows went up slightly. Hughes don't usually deal with small operators. He will when he sees the quality of our stock. The man shrugged. Your funeral. His office is in the brick building at the end of the row. Good luck. They penned the cattle, 37 head, looking worn but reasonably healthy after their rest and the slower pace of the last 2 days. Pete and Jimmy stayed to watch them while Reese and Clay went to find Hughes. The office was exactly where the man said it would be, a solid brick structure that spoke of money and permanence. Inside, a clerk sat at a desk covered in paperwork. We're here to see Mr. Hughes, Reese said, about selling cattle. The clerk looked her up and down, taking in her trail clothes and dusty hat. Mr. Hughes is very busy. Perhaps you could leave your information. Tell him Lee Chen's cousin is here with prime beef from the Southern Territories, Reese interrupted, using her most authoritative voice. He'll want to see us. The clerk hesitated, then disappeared through an interior door. He returned a few minutes later, looking mildly surprised. Mr. Hughes will see you. Follow me. Dalton Hughes was younger than Reese expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and the kind of stillness that suggested he didn't waste time on pleasantries. His office was spare, a desk, 2 chairs, and a map of the territory on the wall marked with pins in various colors. Lee Chen's cousin, he said without standing. That would make you Jimmy's people. I'm Reese Callahan. Jimmy works for me. She met his gaze directly. He mentioned you might be interested in quality cattle. Interested is a strong word. Hughes leaned back in his chair. What have you got? 37 head. Mixed stock, well-bred. Trail-worn but healthy. Brought them 200 miles in 10 days. From where? Silvage, Colorado, south of here. That's rough country. His expression didn't change. Why drive them all the way to Cheyenne when you could sell locally? Because local buyers are trying to cheat me, and I'd rather do business with someone honest. That got a flicker of something amusement maybe in Hughes's eyes. You assume I'm honest. Lee vouched for you. That's enough for me. And if I offer you a price you don't like, then I find another buyer. but I'm here and so are you, and I think we can make a deal that works for both of us. Hughes studied her for a long moment. You're not what I expected. I get that a lot. Reese smiled slightly. So want to come look at my cattle, or should I start asking around for your competitors? He stood. All right, Miss Callahan, let's go see what you've got. They walked back to the stockyards together, Hughes moving with the confident stride of a man who owned more of the city than he let on. He examined the cattle with a practiced eye, walking among them, checking their teeth and hooves, running his hands over their flanks. Pete watched him work with narrowed eyes. Jimmy hovered nearby, clearly nervous about whether this connection would pay off. Finally, Hughes stepped back. They're in decent shape, better than most trail herds I see, but they're thin. They made a hard journey, Reese said carefully. I can see that. He named a price per head that made Reese's heart sink. It was fair, but barely enough to cover the banknote with nothing left over. That's lower than I was hoping for, she said, keeping her voice steady. It's what they're worth in their current condition. Feed them up for a month and I'd pay more. But you don't look like you've got a month. Reese did quick math in her head. She could accept Hughes's offer and make the payment with maybe $15 to spare. Or she could gamble, try to find another buyer, and risk running out of time. Clay caught her eye, a silent question. She gave a tiny shake of her head. She needed to think. Can I have an hour to consider? She asked. You can have 30 minutes. After that, I've got other business. Hughes pulled out a pocket watch. It's 2 o'clock now. I'll be in my office until 2:30. When he'd walked away, Reese turned to the others. Talk to me. What am I missing? You're missing that it's a fair price, Pete said bluntly. Not generous, but fair. And we're running out of time to be picky. If we take it, I make the payment and have almost nothing left. One bad season, and I'm right back where I started. If you don't take it, you might not make the payment at all, Clay pointed out. How many other buyers are you confident you can find in the next 4 days? Jimmy had been quiet, but now he spoke up. There's one other option. My cousin mentioned a man named Garrett runs supplies to the mining camps. He sometimes buys cattle on spec, pays premium prices because he's reselling at a markup. Sometimes, Reese latched onto the word. He's not always in town, and he's picky about what he buys. But if he is in town and if he likes our stock, we might get another $5 a head, maybe more. Reese looked at the cattle, 37 head that represented 10 days of hell and everything she owned. Then she looked at the 3 men who'd gotten them here, each wearing different expressions of worry and hope. All right, she said, making her decision. We have 30 minutes. Jimmy, find out if Garrett's in town and if he'll see us. Pete, stay with the cattle. Clay, come with me. If this goes wrong, I want a witness to exactly how I ruined everything. She tried to smile, but her hands were shaking. Clay touched her elbow briefly. Whatever happens, you made it this far. That counts for something. Tell that to the bank. They found Garrett in a warehouse near the railroad depot supervising the loading of supply wagons. He was a barrel-chested man with a booming voice and a handlebar mustache that would have looked ridiculous on anyone else. Jimmy made the introduction, explaining the situation while Reese stood by and tried to look more confident than she felt. Garrett listened, then looked at Reese directly. You drove cattle 200 miles by yourself. With my crew, 4 of us total. He whistled low. That's either impressive or crazy. Probably both, Reese admitted. Well, both works for me. He laughed, a big sound that filled the warehouse. All right, Miss Callahan, I like your style. Show me what you've got. The walk back to the stockyards felt like miles, even though it was only a few blocks. Reese's watch said they had 12 minutes left before Hughes's deadline. Garrett examined the cattle even more thoroughly than Hughes had, asking questions about breeding age, health history. He clearly knew his business. Finally, he straightened and named a price that was $8 per head higher than Hughes's offer. Reese's knees went weak with relief. But Garrett continued, I'll need delivery to my staging area by tomorrow morning. Can you handle that? Yes, Reese said without hesitation. Then we have a deal. He stuck out his hand and Reese shook it, feeling the calluses that matched her own. As Garrett walked away to arrange payment, Clay let out a breath. You just made that deadline with 2 days to spare. We made it, Reese corrected. All of us. Pete was grinning, actually grinning for the first time in what felt like forever. Jimmy looked like he might cry from relief. They delivered the cattle the next morning. collected the payment in cash that Reese immediately tucked into an inner pocket, and for the first time since her father died, she felt like she could breathe. Standing in the chaos of Cheyenne with her crew around her and enough money to save the ranch, Reese Callahan allowed herself one moment of pure, unfiltered triumph. Then she turned to the others and said, "Let's go home. We've got a bank payment to make." The ride back to Silvage took 3 days, and every mile felt different from the journey north. Without the cattle to slow them down, they made better time. But the absence of that desperate urgency left space for other thoughts to crowd in. Reese kept touching the pocket where she'd secured the money, reassuring herself it was real. $238 in cash, more than enough to settle the banknote with money left over for supplies and repairs. They'd done it. Against every odd, every obstacle, every person who'd said it was impossible, they'd done it. But as the familiar landmarks of home began to appear, the distinctive peak of Copper Mountain, the bend in the creek where her father had taught her to fish, Reese felt tension creeping back into her shoulders. They'd been gone for 13 days. Anything could have happened to the ranch in that time. Clay seemed to sense her worry. He rode close on the second day, matching Ash's pace. "Thinking about what we're riding back to?" he asked, trying not to. "That's not your style." She glanced at him. "You think you know my style after 6 weeks? I think I've seen enough to know you face problems head on." His voice was matter of fact. "So what's really worrying you?" Reese was quiet for a moment, watching the trail ahead. What if Curtis Granger used our absence to do real damage? What if the ranch is stripped, fences torn down, buildings burned? Making the payment won't matter if there's nothing left to save. Then we rebuild. With what? We'll have maybe $30 after settling the note. With what we've got. Hands, time, and the kind of stubbornness that drives cattle 200 miles through hell. Clay's voice was steady. "You didn't come this far to quit because someone knocked down a few fences." "You're right." She straightened in the saddle, forcing her shoulders back. "Whatever we find, we deal with what?" "That's better." They made camp that evening near a stand of pines that offered shelter from the wind. While Pete and Jimmy tended the horses, Reese and Clay gathered wood for the fire. The rhythm of the work was familiar now, comfortable in a way that made Reese realize how much had changed in less than 2 weeks. "Clay," she said as they carried armfuls of deadfall back to camp. "Earlier, when you asked about what happens after we make the payment, I have been thinking about that." He didn't look at her, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly. "Yeah, I meant what I said. I want you to stay on. Permanent. Not just until we're caught up on work, but as a full partner in running the ranch." The words came out in a rush. "I can't pay much more than what you're making now, not right away. But if you stayed, helped build the operation back up, we could make it into something real, something that lasts." Clay set down his wood carefully, then turned to face her. "A partner. Yes. Pete's not getting any younger, and Jimmy's got his family's business to help with. I need someone who can commit long-term. Someone who knows cattle and land and how to make hard decisions." She met his eyes. "Someone I trust. You barely know me. I know you showed up when I needed help. I know you didn't quit when things got hard. I know you backed me up when 6 armed men wanted to rob us, and you talked me through every crisis on that trail without once making me feel like I couldn't handle it." Reese's voice softened. "That's enough to know you're someone worth keeping around." Clay looked away, his jaw working. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I've never stayed anywhere longer than a season. Never put down roots. Never let myself care about a place enough that leaving would hurt. I'm not asking you to promise forever. Just asking you to trim. What if I fail? What if I wake up one morning and the need to move on is stronger than the reason to stay? Then you go and I'll manage, but at least we'll both know we tried." She paused. "And I think you're tired of running, Clay. I think maybe you're looking for a reason to stop." He was silent for a long time, staring out at the darkening landscape. Finally, he said, "Let me think about it. Let me see what's waiting for us back home, and then I'll give you an answer." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Reese accepted it with a nod and carried her wood back to camp, trying to ignore the way her chest felt tight with something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite fear. They arrived back into the ranch just after noon on the third day, and Reese's first sight of the place made her heart drop. The main gate hung crooked on one hinge. 3 sections of fence were down, not cut this time, but battered down as if cattle had been deliberately stampeded through them. The yard was torn up by hoof prints, and someone had broken the window in the barn. But the building still stood. The house was intact. And as they rode closer, Reese saw that someone had nailed boards over the broken barn window and started repairs on one of the downed fence sections. A familiar figure emerged from the barn, and Reese nearly fell off her horse in surprise. Anna Halverson stood there with a hammer in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, looking entirely unsurprised to see them. "About time you got back," she said in her clipped accent. "Been doing what I can, but I'm too old to fix everything these fools broke." Reese dismounted quickly. "What happened?" "Same thing that's been happening. That Granger boy and his men making trouble. Second night you were gone, they drove cattle through here, tore up your fences, broke into the barn looking for I don't know what." Anna took a sip of coffee. "I heard the commotion, came over with my shotgun, told them the next person who stepped foot on this property would leave it in a box." Pete laughed outright. "You ran off Curtis Granger with a shotgun?" "Didn't have to shoot anyone, just had to convince them I would." Anna shrugged. "After that, I've been coming by twice a day to check on things. Fixed what I could. Rest will need proper hands." Reese felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Mrs. Halverson, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't need thanks. Your father helped me more times than I can count. Built my barn roof, brought me supplies during bad winters, never asked for anything in return. Figure I owed him this much." The older woman's eyes softened slightly. "Besides, I don't like bullies. Never have." Clay had dismounted and was examining the damage, his expression thoughtful. "You really held them off alone? Alone and 63 years old." Anna smiled grimly. "Turns out a reputation for being crazy helps. People don't test you as much." They spent the rest of the afternoon assessing the damage and beginning repairs. It was bad but not catastrophic. Mostly superficial destruction meant to intimidate rather than destroy. The kind of thing Curtis Granger would do to make a point without crossing the line into something that could bring legal consequences. That evening, Anna joined them for dinner, the first real meal they'd had in weeks, courtesy of supplies she'd brought over. They sat around the kitchen table, and Reese told her about the drive, the near disasters, the confrontation with the Crown Ranch riders, the sale in Cheyenne. Anna listened without interrupting, her weathered face thoughtful. When Reese finished, the older woman nodded slowly. "Your father would be proud, not just of making the payment, but of how you did it, with courage and smart choices and good people around you." She looked at each of them in turn. "That's what he wanted for you, Reese. Not just the land, but the strength to hold it. I almost lost it a dozen times. Almost doesn't count. You held on. That's what matters." After Anna left, promising to return the next day to help with more repairs, the four of them sat in the gathering darkness and let the weight of accomplishment finally settle over them. "Tomorrow morning I ride into town and settle that note," Reese said. "Who wants to come with me?" "All of us," Pete said immediately. "I want to see the look on that banker's face when you walk in with cash money." Jimmy grinned. "I want to see Eleanor Granger's face when word spreads." Clay just nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. The next morning they rode into Silvage together. All four of them cleaned up as best they could, wearing their good hats and sitting tall in their saddles. The money was secured in Reese's saddlebag, and she felt its weight like armor. The town came alive with whispers as they rode down Main Street. People stopped on the boardwalk to stare. Curtains twitched in windows. By the time they reached the bank, a small crowd had gathered. Reese dismounted and handed Ash's reins to Clay. "This won't take long." The bank was cool and dim after the bright sunlight. Silas Morton, the bank manager, looked up from his desk with an expression of poorly concealed surprise. "Miss Callahan, I wasn't expecting you." "No." Reese walked to his desk and set her saddlebag down with a solid thunk. "I'm here to settle my father's note. It's due today, as I'm sure you remember." Morton's eyes flicked to the saddlebag and something like disappointment crossed his face. "Yes, well, let me pull the paperwork." He made a show of searching through files, moving slowly as if hoping she might change her mind or the money might disappear. Finally, he produced the note. $200 due, plus accumulated interest, bringing it to $228. Reese counted out the money in neat stacks on his desk. $228. I believe that settles the account in full. Morton counted it twice, his lips pressed into a thin line. It appears so. Then I'll need a receipt stating the note is paid and the lien on my property is released. Of course, he wrote out the receipt with agonizing slowness, each word seeming to pain him. There you are. The Callahan property is clear. Reese took the receipt and read it carefully, then folded it and tucked it into her vest pocket. Thank you, Mr. Morton. Pleasure doing business with you. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Morton, the next time Curtis Granger suggests you move up someone's payment deadline to force a sale, you might want to consider whether it's legal. I'm sure the Territorial Banking Commission would be interested in hearing about such practices. Morton's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't. Reese smiled sweetly. Have a good day. She walked out of the bank to find the crowd had grown. Pete and Jimmy were sitting their horses with poorly concealed grins. Clay stood slightly apart, arms crossed, watching the gathering with the alert stillness of a man ready for trouble. Eleanor Granger was there, her face pinched with fury. Her nephew Curtis stood beside her, a tall man with soft hands and hard eyes. Well, Eleanor said loudly enough for everyone to hear, I suppose desperation makes people capable of anything. Tell me, Miss Callahan, what did you have to do to get that money? What respectable woman would? I drove 40 head of cattle 200 miles and sold them for a fair price. Reese interrupted, her voice carrying across the street. I did it with 3 good men and more hard work than you've probably done in your entire life, Mrs. Granger. And I did it without cheating, lying, or stepping on anyone who couldn't fight back. She swung into Ash's saddle, looking down at the crowd. My ranch is paid for. My debt is settled, and I'm not going anywhere. So if anyone else wants to try to run me off my land, I suggest you think real hard about whether it's worth the trouble. Curtis Granger stepped forward, his voice tight with anger. You think this is over. You think one payment changes anything. I think you tried to steal my land and failed. I think you used the bank to cheat me, and it didn't work. And I think from now on, you'd better stay on your side of the fence line because I won't be as patient as my father was. That sounds like a threat. That's a promise, Reese gathered her reins. Come on, boys, we've got a ranch to run. They rode out of town the same way they'd ridden in together, heads high, leaving a wake of stunned silence and furious whispers behind them. Once they were out of sight of town, Pete let out a whoop that startled the horses. Did you see their faces? Did you see Eleanor Granger turn purple? Jimmy was laughing so hard he had to wipe his eyes. That was the best thing I've ever seen. Even Clay was grinning. You've got a gift for making enemies. Only with people who deserve it, Reese said, feeling lighter than she had in months, as if the weight of her father's death and the desperate scramble to save the ranch had finally lifted. Let them talk. We proved them all wrong. But Curtis Granger, it turned out, was not done. 2 weeks later, as they were finishing repairs on the last section of damaged fence, Jimmy arrived with troubling news. Curtis Granger's been meeting with a lawyer from Denver, he said. Word is he's planning some kind of legal action. Reese felt her stomach tighten. Against me? Against the ranch. My father couldn't hear the specifics, but it sounded serious. Clay set down his tools with deliberate care. On what grounds the note's paid, the land is clear. I don't know, but Granger's got money and connections. If he wants to make trouble through the courts, he didn't finish, but the implication was clear. Reese forced herself to take a slow breath, pushing down the panic that threatened to rise. They'd fought so hard, come so far. The thought of losing everything to legal maneuvering made her want to break something. All right, she said finally. We can't do anything about it until we know what we're dealing with. Jimmy, see if your father can find out more. In the meantime, we keep working. We don't give Granger or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing us worried. But she was worried. All through that day, as they worked on the fence, the concern gnawed at her. Legal battles cost money she didn't have, and time she couldn't spare. If Curtis Granger had found some technicality, some loophole or disputed claim, he could tie up the ranch in courts for years.